Without further ado, a few words about Emmett. Um, Emmet Gowin was born in Danville, Virginia, which is really right in our backyard from where I'm sitting. It's a mere 60 miles from Chapel Hill. I like thinking that in some sense, he's kind of our neighbor. On a personal note, I actually once dated a girl from Danville. And whenever I would visit her and was headed home, I always loved that being in Virginia on a small state highway, driving through Danville, there was always this road sign that said, turn right here, Chapel Hill, 54 miles. So it really is a very connected geographic space. Since then, he has had a career filled with multiple major exhibitions and publications, and I won't waste time on the CV, but you should look at it. It's a rich and full life. I think most importantly, he has gifted us with images that have left indelible impressions upon our psyches. And additionally, he has taught and inspired generations of students, most notably at Princeton University, for more than 35 years. In his own work, Emmett is known for poignantly capturing really an expansive range of subjects. His life and work has been fed by a perpetual sense of wonder at the world, a quest for beauty, and an openness to transcendence, and an approach to the world that's filled with curiosity and wonder, and really a deep humility before the great mysteries of life. This ranges from intimate portraits of his wife and family, to the aerial landscapes that explore the devastation of nuclear testing and natural forces, to recent work in Ecuador documenting moss. And I think Emmett is going to take us on a journey through really all of that this evening. Lastly, I would like to say, the one of the things I love about Emmett's work is that he shows that the familiar can still be extraordinary, and the extraordinary can be really right before our eyes. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over and say, let's welcome Emmet Gowin. Thanks, Emmett.
Thank you, Bryce. I'm gonna lift my cup of tea as a toast. I've often thought, facing an audience like at the Nasher or in Boston or at Harvard or wherever it is, that it'd be how much nicer it would be if we could sit in a room together and share a cup of tea. And then we could talk about the things that interested all of us. And if it was my job to tell you what I've done, what I've experienced, which is the way I see this is, in a sense, my task to introduce myself and to speak from my experience. Well, tea would be nice, a glass of wine would be nice. About 4 years ago, I entered into a relationship with the Princeton University press. And it happened almost by accident. I'd been asked to come give a slideshow to the staff of the press. I thought that's the strangest thing I ever heard. I said, but by the way, do you have an art director? And they said, yes, we just got a new art director. And I went there with the thought of, well, we'll have a little conversation and I'll try to convince this sweet lady to do a book of the images that we prepared for the exhibition at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, which compared or put side by side classic works of art from all eras and time zones, with images that my friend Joel Smith and I had drawn together. And in that set was one image, one grid of moth portraits, a little bit like school years portraits of the class all together. And that was the thing that hit her. And she said, oh, well, how about these? Why don't we publish these? And I said, oh, yes, I expect to publish those someday, but I don't know if I'm ready now. And she said, let's do it now. So within the last 4 years, but really it's 2 years since the moth book, the moth portraits, Mariposis Nocturnus, was published. And she said, well, what's the next project? And I said, well, I always wanted to do justice to the work that I had done, what I had seen at the Nevada test site. And I think you couldn't get two bodies of work that were more different. So how do you get from childhood to bodies of work this different? So I'd like to just introduce you to my work in a kind of chronological way. This is probably the first photograph that I saw that meant something to me, and I saw it by accident. I'm emphasizing the importance of chance with this idea of only chance is fair. Schopenhauer, in an essay that has to do with how we change over our lives, says that you come to a certain point in your life where you look back, and even though you realize that most of the important events in your life, and especially the important changes, all occurred by accident. We're not premeditated or intended, but somehow had occurred through the grace of chance. And it reminds me now of Fred Sommer's expression. He said, in the noon of the solemnity of any hour, life returns. And he originally coupled that with a phrase, the mistress of this world has no name. But in my mind recently, in the noon of the solemnity, or just when we're quiet and paying attention, life can return. Only chance is fair. And what that means to me, in essence, is that you could never intend to do new work. Oh, you could wish that you could do new work. But if you really did anything of significance, which seemed fresh and new to you, to ourselves, it would come as a shock. You would think, where did that come from? Mary Oliver says to pay attention. This is our endless and proper work. So anyhow, I wasn't paying much attention. I certainly had no concept of photography, but I saw this Ansel Adams photograph in a photo magazine. And I said almost loud enough, so if anyone else had been there, I said, this is another Christ. This is a resurrection. This is life. One life is over and another life takes its place. And I went home that night and I asked my father for the family camera. And I carried it around for a month or 6 weeks until I actually found a replica in kind of a burned tree with young grass. And at that point, I gave the camera back. I felt like I had fulfilled the obligation that I felt to this picture, but it had had a profound effect on me, so much so that when I went to study art, I started in business school after high school, 2 years of business school and then art school. And then I sort of got enough bravery to convince my parents that I deserved a chance at art school. And right away in art school, I saw The Family of Man. And these pictures, which are not exactly Family of Man, but a little, maybe even more deeply connected to Cartier-Bresson, and particularly Robert Frank, who I actually had the pleasure of meeting in 1963. I was a student from 1961 to 1965 in Richmond, Virginia. And that after the first semester of photo, I started saving money for a Leica camera. And I started working with the Leica camera. And Robert Frank was, of course, a model in many ways. A little experience is worth telling. Someone had shown me The Family of Man. It was the first time I'd seen it. And going through the pages, I realized that in the back of The Family of Man was a photograph with a very similar feeling to one in the front. And I looked back to see the name. I had not been attending to names. And the name under both pictures was Robert Frank. That meant something really powerful to me. It meant that the picture had somehow existed inside of Frank before it found its match in reality. He couldn't have thought it before it happened because you're at the mercy of what's out there. Well, after 4 years wanting to be a painter, but I say 4 years of wanting to be a painter, within the first semester, after the first semester, I actually destroyed or threw away my first semester's negatives. I felt that somehow photography was too important a commitment, and that second semester I was starting over. That was just a trial run. At the end of 4 years, I produced a small handmade book for which this was the cover, 14 original photographs in this cover. And it didn't occur to me at the time that the piece of graph paper that had stimulated my wanting to make a cover drawing for this, I was drawing every day, so the idea of drawing wasn't such an unusual idea. But I'd come home one night and there was this piece of graph paper laying on my desk. And I took it, I took it knowing that that was the signal to sit down and make a cover. So, and then in this image, as I see it now, after all these years, that's 1965, I had included myself as being able to levitate, float in the air, and a camera in each hand. One's my Leica and the other's my mother's camera. I had the good luck then of loving the work of Harry Callahan and getting up the nerve to tell Callahan that I wanted to be his student. Went to Providence, winter of 1964-65, to apply for graduate school. I don't think I could have made a better match. And it was a potent and disappointing realization as my life went on and I left graduate school and began to teach. I had several really talented, gifted, interesting students. And they, of course, would press me, who should I study with? And I would say, well, no one in my mind. Robert Frank had told me, if you're not going to come to New York and make fashion photographs, you should study with Callahan. And he'd added almost as an afterthought, but it struck me powerfully. He said, he's the one true artist who teaches. I didn't argue with Frank, but we probably didn't spend 10 minutes together. And I wouldn't have imposed on him, but one of my painting teachers knew Frank really well and knew Mary Frank and had called Frank and arranged the meeting. In that same time frame as Callahan's graduate student, I met the young artist photographer, Jim Dow. And Jim and I became lifelong friends. And one of the first projects we did together was to visit Walker Evans in New York. After we went to the Library of Congress and did extensive research on Evans. Anyhow, as we were leaving that day, I made this photograph of Evans. I know human nature is such a funny thing, and it comes back to me. It rained that day really hard, so Jim went to get the car while I talked to Evans, trying to ask the questions that I thought Jim would want me to ask. And I put it to him that Lincoln Kirsten had said, oh, that you had seen Paris through the great photographs of Atget and through the literature of Marcel Proust. And he shook his head. Oh, Kirsten does go on. I mean, he overdoes it. And I thought, what a strange thing. Surely he saw the Atget photographs. And I committed myself right then and there to be absolutely transparent with my students and with people I would meet and talk with about my sources and about what I cared about. And I'm showing you this Walker Evans because of its almost vernacular quality. This could be a commercial photograph from Bolivia or Peru, or it could be a Martin Chambi from Peru. but it's the body language of these three men, the way they embrace or touch the truck, associate themselves with the truck. And while it didn't exactly have the note that I saw in Callahan's almost severe beauty of his pictures, the sort of serene austerity, it had something that connected to me. This picture, which Edith and I made of each other, I think her sister May must have taken this picture, but 1968, where I'm out of graduate school, must be 25 years old. She's just had her first child, and we traveled out to see her sister in California. And while we're there, she shows us the picture that had been made by the hospital attendant when her child, who almost died in a birth that should have happened an hour earlier, and the child could easily have starved for oxygen. So the child was removed by cesarean. So I just made up this story that the hospital, wanting to assure the family that everything was okay, had taken a Polaroid camera with high-speed positive, negative material, made this picture and carried it out to the family to show that both the mother and baby were fine. If there's ever a picture that I've known that I wished I had made, this is it. In a funny way, I did make the picture. I laid it down on a kitchen counter and made a 4x5 negative of that Polaroid, preserving it at least and giving it an extended life. And almost right away, as I was beginning to teach, neighbors and friends, I would ask, show me your family album, and this came out. And right away, I looked at this. I said, you can just feel the wisdom pass through this man's hand. It's run along his arm and up into his brain. The touch electrifies her face, and he clenches his cigar, full of life. It had the very things I was looking for, the things that I felt, the things I wanted my pictures to be about. Well, lucky, I was teaching in Dayton for 4 years, from 67 to 71. And right away in 68, a nice show at the George Eastman House with Harold Jones. And while I was up there for the show, little show, I mean, something would barely be put on a resume today, a dozen pictures in what was one of the bedrooms of the George Eastman family house. Some of the folks from the darkroom crew said, we have the Lewis Hine archive here. Are there any Lewis Hines that you like? And I said, well, show me some. And they showed me 100 contact sheets, and I picked this one. And they made a modern print. This is made from a modern print, clearly stamped on the back, property of the George Eastman House, Lewis Hine archive. And when I was working on the show at the Morgan Library, I picked this in particular as something I wanted to show in my slide presentation without any real thought, until I began to reflect and study, what am I going to say about this? And then it came to me. I'm drawn to this because it's a part of my life. I have a sister that looks like that. I have a sister that I didn't know the existence of until I was 15 or 16 years old, kept a secret, who was institutionalized when she was 3 years old, approximately. I didn't know her until she was grown. And when Schopenhauer asked this question about, he says, you look back over your life and all these things happen by chance, and yet they appear to you on reflection as being the chapters in a story. And he said, how can this be? You didn't know how chance was going to intervene in your life. You couldn't really have presumed to include these chapters. And he says, what is it? And he says, he believed it was the unconscious. The unconscious mind connects with those things for which we are hardwired, for which are somehow indelibly embedded in our experience. Then as now, I notice the child's middle finger with its bandage. This too, when I was working on the show for the Morgan Library, I found a postcard of this. I'd purchased this postcard in Crete, but I remember seeing it as a student. I remember its impact on me as a student. In fact, at the end of our senior year, we went to a costume party at the house of one of my teachers, and I constructed a sort of light canvas vest jacket with bare breast like this painted on the outside of the jacket. And Edith wore that to the costume dance. And I came as the Minotaur, the bull. No accident. These things are deeply embedded details in our life. Through Callahan, I got to know Frederick Sommer. Callahan insisted that I would love Sommer. He said he has some of the spiritual qualities you treasure so much. And he's very much, it's a very 1940s way of saying it. He's very much a second story man, meaning he was a person who thought about things. He treasured and valued thought. He loved to just lay on his daybed, read a book, put it down, think. You guys all know photography, and so you know that's Ansel Adams on the left, Frederick Sommer on the right, and a Morris Lewis watercolor on the wall in the background. Sommer was so incredibly important to me. Art is the sensuous apprehension of what we do not yet understand in the presence of nature. Everything about Sommer's personality and his work. And we connected. During that first fall that I was teaching in Ohio, Jim Dow called and said, Sommer's giving a talk tomorrow, get out here. So I drove that night, all night, to get to Rhode Island. I already knew a little bit about Sommer, and it was this picture that really electrified me. It's what made me go back to Callahan and say, can we meet Sommer? Can he come here? And I described this picture, but he knew the picture. Callahan knew what I was talking about. I said, I had never seen a photograph by a contemporary that caused me to think about Leonardo da Vinci, like this photograph of the amputated leg. This too, this I had seen even earlier on the cover of an Aperture magazine, but it didn't mean so much to me then. Years later, I would understand that this was the result of an unconscious effort. The portrait of Max Ernst had been made about 1941, 42. For something was wrong, and it was laid over in the corner of the darkroom, sort of into purgatory. Months later, cleaning the darkroom, he realized that he'd taken another negative, which also had faults, and he'd laid the two, one on top of the other, not realizing it was two negatives, picked them both up and held them to the light, and realized the connection, this groove in which the eyes sit, the two vertical columns. But also Sommer, in 73, Sommer had a really nice exhibition at the New Light Gallery in New York. Harold Jones in the Light Gallery, Tennyson and Fern Schad had, with the closing of Life magazine, Tennyson had read law for Life magazine, and Fern was a picture researcher. And they had the idea of what's going to happen to good journalism, good storytelling photography. And they wanted to start a gallery, and they happened to run into Harold Jones, who started Light Gallery with their blessings and their support. And during the time that Sommer came out for that exhibition, he brought this, the book on the right, Physics and Beyond. And it totally galvanized me. I already had an interest in physics in the slightest, most unintentional way. These two books, Science and Human Values, Jacob Bronowski and Werner Heisenberg's Physics and Beyond. In that same time frame, when in Ohio, as I began to teach, I got a postcard from Ralph Eugene Meatyard with a note saying, send me your work. Here it's going to be good. And I knew who Meatyard was just enough that I could say, okay, I'll take this chance. So I sent him my senior thesis, 50 pictures, which he hung in the offices of his shop. He ground lenses for eyeglasses of Kentucky. This is 4th of July, 1970. And Edith and Jean are being goofy. And then in the picture on the right, Madeline and Jean are wearing the plastic mask, which constitute the defamiliarization that takes place in the Lucy Bell Crater series. Lucy Bell Crater and her husband, Lucy Bell Crater. Just, and I know you folks are probably completely familiar with the work of Meatyard. This is just one of my favorites. What you may not have thought about is, where is this light coming from? How is this picture lit? I see a floor plane covered with straw. I see a wall. I feel like I'm inside, but the light tells me I'm not. It's outside. The man with one arm, Cranston Ritchie, the pinafore with one strap. Now I have to back up just a couple of years, but the point of this is to emphasize the importance of chance. But this is also one of the life-changing moments in our lives. Edith and I were just married a bit, just a year. Graduate school had just begun, and I was drafted. I received my papers to report for duty. I called the draft board and said, it's a mistake. My parents would not approve of this. I don't approve of it. I won't use a gun. Anyhow, I realized I had to go from Rhode Island to Virginia to convince the draft board. And as I was ready to leave, Callahan said, why don't you take a school camera with you? And I said, but Harry, I don't have film holders and I don't have film. He said, stop by the house on your way home. I'll see if I can do something. So I did. He met me at the door, handed me 5 4x5 film holders. He said, if they're loaded, but I don't know, but if they're loaded, it might be +X. I didn't even know what kind of film it was. And of course, I was going home to deal with the draft board. So I drove, got there, met the draft board. It was very, very lucky. In those days, you'd go into the draft board. And that particular day, there were 5 women sitting in the office. And they said, well, why can't you serve in the military? And I explained my reasons. And after we talked for a while, one of the ladies said, well, honey, you wouldn't last 5 minutes in Vietnam. And I agreed that that was right. Well, that night, somewhat with an understanding of the papers that I needed to fill out and with some touch of blessing from these ladies, I went to my wife's mother's house for the night, and niece and nephew were living with their grandmother. And this little child got in my lap and she was talking to me about, oh, we're going to do all these wonderful things in the morning and you're going to take pictures of me. And I thought, oh, she'll forget that. And the next morning she got out this box of dolls and said, this is our first job. And by the time I'd resolved how to present her with the dolls, which was a trial and error situation. Those five film holders, with one sheet on each side, 10 sheets of film. This was the last film, if there was film. Later, of course, I discovered that it really was film, and it really was plus X, and the film is only slightly underexposed. But I knew that was a transcendent moment. The child had pulled me into a situation I could never have invented. I would never have asked her to become my subject and become an accomplice in constructing something like this. And the little puppy, you don't tell puppies what to do. And very quickly, as I began to teach, as we began to raise our child, this is probably taken the summer before Elijah was born. And these pictures were coming out of life itself. I felt like I can barely think. I look up, I pay attention, and I see these marvelous faces. There's one small conspiracy here. I use the rise and fall of the lens, so the two sets of eyes would line up. But really, that's the only thing. That's the only subtle conspiracy. So often, well, I asked them that morning, they were all wearing their sleeping dresses. And I said, oh, come to the yard for a picture. But the little nephew, when he saw what was going on, went back into the background and began to work. There are at least 4 negatives of this, and this is the only one that's the real thing. And again, Callahan told me this story about having worked a whole year and feeling that he had accomplished nothing. He had one picture. And Edward Steichen from the Museum of Modern Art was planning a visit to Chicago and said, get your pictures ready. And he said, I only have one thing. And on seeing the picture, Steichen said, sometimes one picture is worth a year. And I think of it with this image because I felt that 1968, though we worked all summer, I felt I didn't have any pictures. Until somehow I thought that may be a picture. Again and again, this is what's not in the picture is what had happened. The turkeys were posing, were being held by these 2 children, and one of them broke its bonds and tried to fly. The child was struck in the eye by a wing feather, and they called for me to take the birds, and I put the birds on the ground. Instead of consoling the injured child, I went directly to the camera without looking back and took the cable release and took the picture. That particular image didn't make sense to me for several years. This I knew. She had come to me one day with 2 eggs from the barn and said, I look what I found. And when she said it, she crossed her arms, and I thought, that's transcendent. This is the wisdom of her body making a presentation, making some small thing into a more luxuriant, ultra reality. And she pestered me about that picture until over a couple of summers, we would revisit the idea until the picture met my expectations. Expectations is the wrong word, but I'm trying to say she would quiz me. Where is the picture? Where is the picture with the eggs? And again, our extended family was a super important subject. My wife, Edith, or this is probably the most published picture of Edith. The image that I showed you earlier, the snake goddess from Knossos. This, I think, I had that morning, I had realized that the circle would take in a greater majority of the front room and all of the wild Christmas wreckage. And I had called into the other room and asked Edith to come in and stand in. And I wasn't thinking snake goddess, but now with this distance, I can see uh, she often stood in for the goddess. The discovery that the lens that was in the nature of lenses to make a circle was something I didn't consciously know until I'd actually made a cardboard mount. And my only lens in that first 2 or 3 years was a short angulon lens, wide angle, for a 4x5. But on an 8x10, it would project this circle clear out to the end of the glass. I mean, when you run out of glass, you run out of image. These pictures, so there was something about setting up the 8x10, the beauty of the coverage of the lens, the formality of setting it up so that our relatives became sensitized and also collaborators in the idea of, oh, if Emmett wants a picture, that's important. He knows something we don't know. He's working on something bigger than what we see. And I'm sort of trying to speak for them. And I always think, there's particularly this picture of our Aunt Maggie, Edith's Aunt Maggie, who from 1938 on, when her second child died, she was Rh negative factor. Her first child survived, but her second and third child both died very soon after birth. And she, in a magnanimous way, replaced her own deceased children with the rest of the children of the family. And with a marvelous performance at Christmas, she would dress up in this terrible costume, and it is terrible costume, and she stored it in a trunk over the summer. And of course, it was made of a kind of starched, painted gauze. So stored in the confusion of a trunk, it was hopeless. But they did this great performance where she would come in total darkness to a house where all the children were gathered and ring a bell, signaling the approach of Santa, and the children would go to the window and peer out into the darkness. The adults would turn off the lights inside. Santa would dance around in the moonlight and then be gone, leaving the presents on the front porch. As the children grew, especially the boys, there was something so wonderful to watch them crazy, wild with excitement, running around the house, looking to see which uncles were missing. You know, they had a sense that this was a performance. They never decoded, they never broke through that old world mentality that Santa could have been an aunt instead of an uncle. We began to travel then, 72, 73, we went to England the next year to Italy. And I was using the circles. 72, Edith's grandmother, Renee Bohr, dies. And this is really the picture I thought I was making. And I say the picture I was making because that morning I was compelled to make a single negative, do it quickly, move the coffin, which coffins would rest in the family house in those days, and racks with flowers would come from the florist. And I had opened the window shades because they would be done in near darkness, I guess making this all more tolerable or presentable. But I could feel the presence of people who wouldn't approve of this, and was determined to make a single negative. And only as I took the camera apart and put it back in its case did I feel, that I was doing something completely wrong, that this particular moment would never return again. And not knowing that I had just double exposed a sheet of film from England on top of the coffin. You know, I was expecting this. I would have had this. I think the angel of death said something to me and told me, get the camera back out, you're not finished. From 72 to 73, with the death of the grandmother, the death of the two oldest males, our worlds seem to be changing and require a different view. And the children had built a tree house up into a high perspective. And I had always had a feeling about high perspective, but a board had fallen out of the tree house. I put the camera where the board had fallen away, pure chance, pure childish treehouse building. Where the board had fallen out was the one place the camera belonged. And the camera with this circular view barely encompassed the exact amount. And it was the grandmother's house in the distance. Now Edith owns that house. And we go there and spend our summers there. We'll go there for Christmas. That next year, Edith has her second child. I love the circular films hanging on the clothesline. Behind me here on the wall, there's a clothesline on which prints hung today. Well, that film, I have the tray with the photo flow sitting in the chair. But something, she was changing clothes or something. I said, oh, that's a picture. So 72, 73, 74, 75, we begin to travel more. And I know that to continue on, just I'd had this experience when I was very young on the city bus in Richmond, Virginia. And every time the bus would stop, there would be a Robert Frank picture looking at me from outside. I could just sit on the bus and collect Robert Frank pictures, and a kind of cold chill ran through me. And I thought I could be collecting Robert Frank pictures into my old age. Would that satisfy? And I knew I had to change. I knew the authenticity of the family work. I mean, that work was widely accepted. And I believed in that work. I knew that work was coming out of life itself. But what else, where else could I find a subject? And I found this subject in Siena, in Italy, because we were going to close friends in Italy every summer. And we would go out on adventures driving each day. And I'd come to this garden, and I realized the garden was an important image for me. My father had been a gardener. His father was a farmer. My wife's family were farmers until they worked in the cotton mills. So there's something about the human constructed, transformed landscape spoke to me. You know, near Assisi in Italy. I mean, you know that the people live in that house feel like their arms are reaching out to embrace this field. They feel this space. They know every plant, every tree. They know when the trees are due. They know when they're ready to harvest. They know when they have to be pruned. 1980, jump forward 5 years, and you're not old enough, probably, oh, a couple of you are, to remember the eruption of Mount St. Helens, but I'd gotten a commission from the Seattle Arts to come to Washington State that summer of 1980, and April 18th, Mount St. Helens erupted. And I had my thoughts about what would I see or do in Washington State. I was thinking agriculture, or I don't know what, but I was thinking, and I was thinking about making aerial photographs too. Whenever I see this, and this is a nice reference, the mountain with the death wish, and I think the importance of language. We're getting a real lesson in language from the political scene in this moment, where it isn't just bad or non-instructive use of language, but lies. But mountain with the death wish is just a kind of transformation of language into anthropomorphic foolishness. The mountains don't have death wishes. But I was excited about the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and you can just feel in this picture the shock wave pass down through this valley, go down to the stream bed and up the other side, flattening everything that was in the path of the shock wave. But to the right and the left, the trees are left by chance, standing. Another chance. I had been in Vancouver with the Forest Service begging all day long for permission to make a flight over Mount St. Helens, to get near, but a flight in particular, because I knew that I was ready to start making aerials. I'd made some images with my 8x10 that looked like aerials, but were actually made from a hillside. And I liked the perspective, I liked the mystery of the view. Well, in working with the Forest Service, after a couple days of working, I was told, no, not now, maybe at the end of the summer, maybe in the fall. I was told no, and really disappointed. Edith with the two boys in the car. We left just almost crying and drove from Vancouver to Seattle. And just with no thinking whatsoever, I looked as we entered the edge of Seattle, and there was the airport. I thought, I want to go over the airport and ask some questions. And I went to the airport, asked the desk lady, is anybody going up to Mount St. Helens from here? And she said, oh yeah, he's just came in. Just wait a minute, he'll talk to you. And a pilot came in, and I said, I'm an artist. I'm with the city of Seattle doing this project, and I want to see Mount St. Helens. And I've just had this conversation with the Forest Service, and they've said no. The pilot looked at me, he says, with kind of a smile, he said, can I call you a researcher? And I about said, you can call me mud, you can call me anything. And he picked up the phone, called Vancouver. He said, this is Joseph. I have a researcher here. We're leaving right now for the mountain. We'll be up there for 2.5 hours. The identification of the aircraft, you know. Thank you. And just like that, I was in an airplane and up. And within those 2 hours over Mount St. Helens, well, really an hour and a half, I made a complete series that fulfilled the requirements of the commission of that summer, which was a commission was to make 10 pictures, which it seems oh so simple, but when you haven't got a single good picture, it seems impossible. Well, I made about 18 pictures that I still love on that hour and a half flight. And one of the treasures of that flight was being told by the pilot as I'm flying over things like this. And he says, I don't know what you're seeing. He said, but I come up here every day and I have to tell you, you're photographing the wrong things. So I knew a couple of years later when I saw this confluence of two rivers where ash from the mountain had built up into a kind of blockage of the river. There's the Cowlitz River coming in from your bottom right. And it's full of volcanic ash. And the Columbia River with logs sitting in the left-hand corner that's the image. And I would have photographed it for just the beauty of the shape. This is what Brancusi referred to as complexity resolved. It's so complicated and yet resolved in the beauty of simplicity. I saw that one evening as we were landing, coming in back from the mountain. The next morning, we went back again. So about 8 or 10 hours had transpired. And taking off from the airport, we just naturally went out over where these two rivers came together. And here in this image, the second image, you can really see the ash spilling out into the clear water of the Columbia River and mixing, and the turbulence of the mixing, and the kind of difficulty of the water mixing, the dilution of the ash flow. And this beautiful trapezoid, this diamond shape that had formed as a kind of sandbar or sediment bar in the middle of the river, had almost disappeared overnight. And that was so instructive for me. Later that summer, I did get permission to fly in a helicopter up to the mountain, and we had permission to land in a few places. And we landed on this promontory looking back to the mountain. And this is actually the photo that I was taking with that camera. I had actually taken the picture, and then I backed off. My pilot, the helicopter pilot, our oldest son Elijah, was with me, but he said he didn't want to get out of the aircraft. He later joked to me. He said, "Says two generals shouldn't take the same airplane." And I thought, wow, it's got a beautiful sense of self-confidence. I like that. But anyhow, the pilot had said, "Let me take a picture of you by your camera." And he did do. That didn't interest me. But this, the 8x10 looking down onto this configuration, which is called Bear Cove. And the mountain itself became a mystery and something. And I returned every year, 2, 3, sometimes 4 times until 1986. And in 86, something happened. I was cut off from the mountain because of rain. And also I learned some things. A friend at Princeton University had asked me to collaborate with him on a project involving radiation and nuclear waste at a site called Hanford, which I didn't know anything about. And I actually said to my friend, "I think this would make me too sad. I don't want to do it." Well, we'll get to that. And so from Mount St. Helens, at the time I'm in Mount St. Helens, 1982, we get a phone call. Somehow they found us in Oregon from the secretary of the Queen of Jordan. And I knew that the Queen of Jordan, who was a wonderful person as a student, had since married King Hussein. And so when I was told it was a call from the palace, I said, "Oh, okay." But I didn't expect it to be the Queen. But her secretary said, "We would like you to come to Jordan," in the summer of 1982. And I almost didn't take my cameras with me. Of course, now looking back, I'm glad I did. This image, which I didn't photograph for about 3 years, I passed it every time I would go into this canyon that wound its way, which you probably know it from the Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's used as a scene in the film. But Petra is this marvelous site that was destroyed by earthquake in 263 BC. Anyhow, I later realized that image of this channelway, this waterway, approaching this tomb. I had seen that as a child in my father's Bible. My father was a Methodist minister, and I would see images in the back of his Bible. It was called I'm forgetting what it's called. The palace, not the palace tomb. Oh, anyhow, it's just a name. This is working in Jordan, put into us a certain rapport with the ancient world, and something I had seen on television, a program about ancient Israel and the earliest Christians, who were all Jews, as Christ was a Jew, had, when the temple of Jerusalem was destroyed, the city was sacked by the Romans, these people had gone into the central deserts of Turkey and formed monastic villages. And I heard about this and decided to go there in the summer of '85. So it's like a kind of conscious decision. I'll chalk one up for conscious decisions. And you can see these were cells in which people lived, carved right out of the living stone. What really struck me, that this was volcanic ash, just like Mount St. Helens, being laid down 50,000 to 100,000 years ago, compacted into not any longer a kind of loose ash, but a kind of solid stone. And solid, I really thought it was until 2 or 3 years later, returning, went around a corner thinking I would find this configuration to find an empty space. It had collapsed in an earthquake that summer. And this, as I thought about that, I put in 3 or 4 images that connect with this idea of the chance of deluge, the chance of turbulence and storm. There's a marvelous drawing by Leonardo da Vinci done in the very last year of his life. It's the series is referred to as the deluge. I synchronize that in some ways, the deluge, the expulsion from the garden. There's a 10th, 11th century bronze door from a medieval English church. This is a copy of the door that's in the Victoria and Albert Museum. But everything about the beauty of these figures, the angel with his sword, expelling the naked Adam and Eve. I grew up in a religious family. Of course, father a minister, but my mother was a Quaker. She was really the more spiritual of the two, but both extremely religious. That meant so much to me. I think in our early youthful images, the fact that I married Edith, the right woman, that she understood instinctively very early on that in presenting her nakedness to the camera, she was in the role of the Eve or the first mother. This image, which if you know it, you know what it is. If you don't know it, you might not guess what it is for a long, long time. It's interesting to question an image like this. Is it made by insects, by animals, by people? Animals, I mean, a human being an animal, but this is human made, and it's an act of destruction, and it's a terribly tapestry-like construction to be a destruction, featuring focused intensity in some of the circles. It's Germans plowing a airfield so that the Allies can't use the airfield in North Africa. This is a Royal Air Force photograph. And I saw this right at the end of my undergraduate work in Beaumont Newhall's first history of photography, given to me by my favorite teacher, Jewett Campbell, a wonderful painter. And this hit me. In some ways, the way this hit me. I understood my relationship to this before I understood what it was. And that's much more important. People forget what you say, what you do, they forget your name, but they remember how they feel about something. It's Maya Angelou who said that. I haven't exactly done justice the way she said it, but this is the 4 millionths of a second, micro millionths of a second into the explosion of an atomic bomb. This is 1953, the bomb, How, and it's on a tower. And the tower is suspended by guy wires, and the jets of gas run down the wires. And I started to build a preamble to this image when transitioning from Mount St. Helens to this place that I'd heard about, but didn't really want to go. But in 1986, the mountain was enshrouded in rain, and there was nothing else to do. I didn't think I would be allowed to fly over the Hanford city site, because this is where the uranium was processed to make plutonium to trigger the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But this ghost of a city And something else that happened on the way home, I thought I saw a missile silo under construction. I was wrong, but it made me want to understand something. And I went that next summer looking for missile silos. This is an intercontinental ballistic Minuteman 2 or 3 silo in North Dakota. It's a kind of turbulence of another kind, but there's a paper mill. And the water that's processed through a paper mill is toxic, and it has to be treated for about a month before it is not, it's not deacidified, it just has less of the terrible toxins that are then pumped into a river. And that was a mill in Texarkana, Texas, that used 105 million gallons of water a day. This is just a simple, beautiful piece of nature, an alluvial flow out into a valley. Sometimes we were looking for silos or military installations. It was at Hanford that I saw the first pivot circle, or the agricultural irrigation system. And you can see these arms, the white line is water being sprinkled or sprayed on this crop, probably alfalfa. And this is water from deep inside the earth being pumped out of an aquifer, water that's millions of years old and will never be replenished without another million years to do it, being pumped out onto the landscape in a desert where without irrigation, nothing could grow. And at a rate that 20 circles, and this is more than 20 circles, 20 circles is using almost as much water as a city of 2 million people. Well, as I made aerial pictures, I kept having this experience of feeling that I was seeing transcendently through the surface of things beyond. And this is quite literally seeing through the surface. This is a cornfield, a wheat field. And what's happening in the substrata beneath the field of wheat or corn, the fractured stone beneath the soil is being imprinted in the growth of the crop. Archaeologists use this knowledge to find buried architectural treasures. This is a map out of Carol Gallagher's book about nuclear consequences. This is the pathways that you can read the caption for yourself. Above ground detonations, the areas of the continental United States crossed by more than one nuclear cloud. And the extent of the nuclear clouds, and if you can just imagine the corner of Utah near the Nevada test site on the Nellis Air Force Base. It's a dreadful thing. Anyhow, in 1988, I think, I was invited, I'd been writing to the Department of Energy, and I was invited to come out and look around. But in the end, they said, no, we're not going to let you fly. I'm sorry. Can't you just do something from the ground? And I guess other people had made pictures from the ground. And I said, no, I need to fly. This is something that I now understand. Well, almost 10 years went by. And with the change of the Cold War, I wrote again. And the second time I was granted permission to visit. And that map was showing my pilot where I could go and where I couldn't. And in about a 2-hour period, that first visit, I was able to make or probably 20 rolls of film. And in the end, a dozen real pictures. But began the long process of education, self-education. What has happened here? What is this? These I intuitively understood immediately, and my observer from the Department of Energy disagreed until we saw them maybe the third time, and he talked to people within the history department of the Department of Energy who had to admit this is the only thing they could have been. These were where young men were put in trenches to wait while the shock wave would go over. The bomb would blow up, the shock wave would pass, and people would get up and walk down to ground zero. This is called the Atomic Training School. But this is what the space looks like. This is the upper part of Frenchman Flat. And this is just a sample from the book on the Nevada test site that I did with Princeton. This is the largest of all the craters. This was considered a Atoms for Peace project to see how atomic bombs could be used in earth moving projects. And this was a massive bit of earth moving. This it's moved a ton of earth, equivalent to a ton of earth for every person alive at that moment on Earth. A massive hole in the ground. A second and a third flight completed my experience. But in that time, with the cooperation of the pilot, observer from the Air Force, and my observer from the Department of Energy, I started to understand what had happened here. This is the overview of Frenchman Flat. And I want to point to the screen. I guess I can take my cursor and do it. Areas like this, the bend in the road, you can just see here, there's something happened there. Probably here, something happened. But there's no crater in the ground. There's no big hole because these were above ground tests. And at one time, I thought that all of the 200 above ground tests whose radioactivity traveled east and was dumped on all of us, I thought all those 200 above ground tests were done here on Frenchman Flat. But the truth was, this is an alkali lake bed. So dusty that when the bomb went off, it obscured the view. And all the subsequent above ground tests were moved to Yucca Flat, where the ground was much more solid and didn't throw up dust. On the left-hand side, that shadow running all the way up through the picture is the Yucca Fault. And that's a geological slip zone, which at the time that Yucca Mountain was being considered for deep underground storage of high intensity nuclear waste, it had been felt that there had never been a historic, which is to say in the last 3,000 years, slippage of this fault. And in 1996, it slipped. This is a nice little puzzle. We had waited on the ground for the sun to reach the horizon or nearly reach the horizon. And we had waited just off camera, as they say, for a chance to see this with the sun pouring into it. And did we know we had just a small amount of fuel? And that was it. We had maybe 45 minutes over the test site. We had spent the day out at the test site, but lacking fuel, we refueled at the site and then sat on the ground for hours until the light reached the twilight or the evening angle of the light, which I knew would present things in a much stronger shadow. Anyhow, we took off, and this is the first thing we saw. And even though I thought, oh, this makes perfect sense, I asked the pilot to fly to the other side of the crater. This is a huge crater. It's 1,260 feet in diameter, the measure across. And we began to fly around it. He quickly, at that altitude, transversed to the opposite side. But I invite you to guess what the other side looks like. You know, what would happen if you flew to the other side of this? Well, this is what it looks like. I mean, I want to tell you how exhilarating it was to see this curvature, this beautiful parabola shadow projected into a semisphere convert itself into a straight line. I would never have guessed it. This is when Leonardo instructed his students to always consider themselves disciples of experience. This is what he was talking about. And there's a tiny dot of shadow on the crater wall, which is the shadow of the helicopter. When I was working on the book with Princeton, we got to a certain point of 65 pictures, and our Italian publisher said, oh, but you can't just have 65 pictures. It makes the page count come out wrong. You need to add 2 pictures. And I said, well, yeah, no, absolutely. We'll put in 2 pictures. And I went into the rejects, you could call the side B, the unpublished picture files, and picked out 2. And both, I'll say by chance, just by virtue of the kind of rhythmic beauty and completeness of the images themselves, say, well, these 2 suggest something that are not in the other pictures. But I have no idea what happened here, and probably nothing happened here. This is just, you know, we're looking at what was once seafloor. This was once an ancient sea, Nevada. And so this is ocean floor with ridges that have worn down in rain. And what else has happened here? And I want to point to this little valley beyond. The valley on a map is labeled Plutonium Valley, but it was only when I went to Google Earth and the gallery, Google Gallery, and the Google community additions to the map did I realize that this had been labeled, this valley had been labeled not only as Plutonium Valley, but an explanation given that 3 or 4 tests were done in this valley, which were to test what would happen to a core of plutonium if the bomb only exploded in a conventional way and didn't fission or wasn't trapped inside the ground. At this time, all the testing had shifted from above ground to above ground. After 1959, I guess it was, no above ground testing intentionally, though there was testing that was happening. Well, what had happened there? I didn't finish the story. One of these tests, 3 of the safety tests worked just fine, nothing escaped. But the 4th test blew the plutonium core into 1 million fragmented shards of plutonium, which a microgram of plutonium entering the body, inhaled or swallowed, is enough to kill any human or animal. And it's the most radioactive part of the test site. Though deep inside the Earth, there's plenty of radioactivity, but the surface radioactivity is limited to a handful of particularly concentrated sites. This from a friend, a Swiss watercolor illustrator, Camille Hess-Honegger. And she's a entomologist and an illustrator who's concentrated on collecting insects at nuclear disaster sites like Chernobyl, a 3-mile island. This is a true bug, and it's only the head of the bug. It's a cicada. And the 2 eyes you can see, one is completely normal and the other, the right eye, is malformed. And this is radioactive interference with the genetic messaging that happens when the DNA is clipped by radioactivity. So, and her work in hundreds of examples features the effect of radioactivity on insects. It's an amazing book. Hemiptera is the subject, and her name, Cornelia Hess-Honegger. If you look for even just radioactive insects online, you'll find the book. If I wound the clock back 20 years, actually made an insect picture. I knew I was interested in insects, but it was only after photographing the Nevada test site that I started going to Ecuador and Panama in Panama, I started to find a subject. I thought I would make pictures of the forest, perhaps. And I learned that this is what's left of what was there about 1900, 1906, a community of several thousand people living in this remote area, extremely remote. It's the most remote part of Panama on the border with Colombia, the Darien Gap. But there were thousands of people living there. I began in the other end, the Costa Rica end of Panama, in a research station, photographing insects just where they landed, wherever they happened to be by chance. That's where I'd photograph them. And with time, by the time I'd come to page number 8, it occurred to me that I could copy some of my favorite works of art and take these along, and perhaps I could convince the insects to move over or to slide onto or walk over onto a work of art that I found particularly beautiful. And in this picture, in the most central picture, the background is one of these trees from the fresco by Piero della Francesca, The Visit of the Queen of Sheba. And I began to copy out of my books favorite illustrations or favorite reproductions of works: Grunwald, Hercules Sagers, Mantegna, The Medical History of the War of Rebellion, Civil War medical book, Degas. And the book that we did with Princeton was 51 of these plates, which was really half of what I aspired to do. I wanted to make 100 pages with 25 images, 25 distinct new species samples, specimens on each page. I'm still working. This is page 57, done this last winter in Bolivia. You can guess what this is. I went through the best source was the Smithsonian in Washington, though they certainly didn't have everything, but I would just, millions of specimens. I simply opened every drawer and wrote down the names of what I recognized. This is something else, but you go to a place to do one thing and something else presents itself. I'd taken along a black cardboard silhouette. I actually had just traced a negative from the enlarger onto a piece of black cardboard. Did not cut it out until I was in Panama. And one night, I knew that was my last night. I had arranged these forest leaves on the background. And 4 o'clock in the morning, I thought of the silhouette. And I put it up and went back to work, photographing the insects. And an hour or so later, I turned around and I really lost in thought and was shocked to see this silhouette, the shadow. And the dislocation was so great, I thought she was actually there. And I thought, even a shadow holds your memory. We also learned that the light, which could burn you, it's very hot, and we slowly learned we could approach it in certain ways. But the light itself was flashing 60 times a second. And so that a time exposure actually revealed the wing strokes of flying insects. All of a general portrait art that began before we were married and still working on it. I mentioned in the synopsis that I wanted to say a few things about hidden lightness, which is an idea from Jacob Bronowski, the mathematician. And at the Morgan, we would take images that we knew that we could edit from work I had done over these 50 years and put it with, in this case, Odilon Redon drawing of a human spider, with something that had something in common with it. And this was the announcement, the card for the exhibition. It's 2 pages from the catalog. It's a much more ordinary contrast, comparing contrast or association of uh, a book of hours with a border of insects and flowers. But it's a heritage that I identified with so strongly. You would never guess what we put with this, uh, which even the day it was done, I realized unintentionally, she just grabbed him and held him upside down. And I thought it was so beautiful. It's Elijah when he was about 2, I think 19, oh, I'll get the year wrong, 70, no, 68, 69. Anyhow, that this is the fetal position upside down. So at the Morgan, some of the medieval specialists showed us a variety of things that they thought we might find interesting in this, which looks, of course, vaginal. We said, great, not knowing that the Passion, I'm reading from the wall label now, Christ's intricately narrated martyrdom became the focus of popular piety in the Middle Ages. In what an inscription calls precisely life size is a rendering of the wound in Christ's side, one of the 5 holy wounds. When a soldier pierced Christ's crucified body, the wound miraculously issued both water and blood, symbolizing baptism and sacrifice. The wound's vaginal form signifies that this wound gave birth to the church, much as Eve was born from Adam's side. You take all of that with a grain of salt, of course, but those monks knew what they were doing. They turned, well, it fits the page very nicely, but they knew this had transcendent associations. William Blake, who, thank goodness for me, Blake's holdings at the Morgan Library are extensive. This from the book of Job, Leviathan and Behemoth, which we paired with a copper mine. Some of the images were disassociated. This is an index of not wounds. It's easy to associate those since we've just seen the wound. But these are, insects have the ability, they store alkaloids and toxins in their body, and if disturbed, will eject a kind of spurt or gush of toxins that signal to a predator that I'm toxic, don't eat me. And one evening, a particularly active sheet, there have been a lot of expelled toxins on that sheet, which Edith was the one who came to me and she said, you got to photograph these toxic stains because they're so beautiful. And when we went to pair an aerial view of Frenchman Flat from the test site, Joel was the first to associate this view of Hercules, the apotheosis of Hercules as a genius. And Hercules, in an act of rage, has been induced by Zeus's wife to kill his own wife and child. And so he's holding a child, or he has the knife in his hand, striding through the sky. A man with too much power for his own good. Now, this is really the conclusion, and I sort of wanted to back up after I'd covered those sort of pockets of work and just say, my wife and I, as we're kids, probably the earliest picture of her that I still print, though we're working on a little pandemic portfolio of 20 or so pictures that had never been printed. I'm looking at you, Bryce. That during this period of isolation, we went through all of the contact sheets and all of the negatives, trying to bring order to these contact sheets. Some things are known and are published. This published several times. In talking or thinking about Edith, I always think of these casual pictures with our friends in Italy, our older boy Elijah, and the physical closeness of these boys to their mother. Uh, she had a genius. Hercules' genius was of one kind, and Edith's genius was a kind of tenderness, a tough tenderness. And her boys knew whose side she was on. Sommer has a saying that more than one image can be made from the same parts. And there's a good 10 years plus between this image and this image, but they're made out of the same cardboard cutout, but handled in a different way. And crazy. A few summers ago, I traced all of the cardboard cutouts I had made over 10 or so years of going to the tropics with these cardboard cutouts. And I made a large painting tracing the cutouts. I thought you'd find this interesting. If we time at the end, an interviewer once asked me, could they see the darkroom? And I said, of course you can, but you would learn more if you looked at my books. Well, it got us into trouble, but it made a good story later. But it made me laugh. And I thought, well, I'm going to show you my darkroom. I have 2 enlargers. It's so simple. Early contact sheet, part of the pandemic portfolio, something we'd never printed. A picture from 1967. Same year as the back of the head, but I'd never been able to print that. And I added a few pictures that are from the last 5 years. This is 2009. This is probably from 2 summers ago. This is from right now. Reality is greater than our dreams, yet it is within ourselves that we find the clues to reality. Clues are essences and keys are stronger than the doors they open. Life itself is not the reality. We are the ones who put life into stones and pebbles. If we did not dream, reality would collapse. This is the last image. And you know this story. This is a beautiful drawing, a finished drawing by Mantegna, Andrea Mantegna, Italian. And it's the story of Solomon, the judgment of Solomon. 2 children are born to 2 mothers, and overnight, one of the 2 children dies. In the night, the mother of the dead child switches babies, like Maurice Sandak's outside over there, where the changelings come to change an ice effigy for the baby. But this problem is brought before King Solomon, and Solomon's judgment is simple. Cut the living child in half and give half to each mother. This is the nuclear dilemma. This is the democracy dilemma. This is the Supreme Court dilemma. This is the justice dilemma. And of course, the real mother said, oh no, give her the child. Don't cut the child apart. And of course, Solomon knew instantly who was the real mother.
Wow.
Well, Bryce.
Yeah.
That's it.
Wow.
Now, shall I say, I don't want to say stop share, or do I want to say stop share? Just leave this up.
Leave it up in case we want to jump back to a particular image.
Okay.
You know? So I think we're okay like this. I will say that we've got a handful of questions, and I made so many notes furiously that I've run out of paper to do that on. And I don't think anybody wanted you to stop, but I am going to try to distill my thoughts and some of the questions that have come in to hopefully a couple of really focused.
I'm going to have a sip of tea, of cold tea now.
Yes. So I'm gonna ask for the audience and your forgiveness, because this first question I'm going to ask you has a little bit of a preamble. We've just looked at a whole big swath of your career, And there was this moment that hit me in particular that, boy, oh boy, you went through like, really a moment's breath. And that was the moment when, and like yourself, I was wildly influenced by Robert Frank and that generation. But you were mentioning you were traveling and you realized you could just make a collection of Robert Frank images. And really in your presentation, to me, that seemed to be the transitional moment where you found a different voice, from documenting family life and human life to where you started looking at a landscape and backing up and changing your elevation. And that seems to have influenced so much that has come after. And so, in a weird way, my question is about that moment, and that, the title of this talk is Only Chance is Fair. And yet, there are conscious decisions you make. And there's other phrases I've heard where you make your own luck. But you made sort of conscious decisions that I'm not going to copy Robert Frank. I'm going to seek my own voice and then let myself be open to the chance that comes. But it seems to be a pivotal moment in your earlier work and your later work. And I wonder if you would mind just speaking a little bit more about sort of that moment where to me, it seems like a real shift happened.
Well, you're absolutely right, and you have to remember, I was a very young man. That was 1964. I was riding the bus in Richmond on the way to work at the State Highway Department, and I actually lost that job in a couple of weeks later because I refused to get a haircut. I sort of Beatles mop at that time, and I thought that's an absurd thing to ask. I was working there as a printer, and every morning I'd ride the bus uptown to the governmental complex and work in the lab. But anyhow, that one morning, it was just, not every morning were there Robert Franks outside the window, but that morning there were things, something in a store window and a child coming through the door, or things in relationship to each other, complementarity of opposites, which so characterized Frank. And of course, the year 1964 is not that far away from 1959 when The Americans was published. And Richmond, Virginia looked exactly like the surrealist capital of the world, which it was, still probably is. But in 64, it, uh, the the injustice of the way blacks were perceived and treated, the inequality between those who had great financial resources and those who had almost no resources were everywhere. It was just everything about Richmond looked like Robert Frank had projected it all onto the city. It was that the wisdom of Robert Frank was to be seen everywhere. If once you had understood what Frank was showing you, and that's what I meant by saying that Frank couldn't have made those two pictures have so close a feeling if the feeling hadn't been in Frank. Frank had the feeling of a particular sadness, a particular pathos, a particular sympathy, empathy with the underprivileged or the downtrodden, or what, I don't know the right words. Those sound like pat words, but Frank was in tune with America in a way maybe that some people would have said only a European could have seen America with the objectivity which he did. We would have glossed over it. Well, but what he found was what he already knew. What he found was what he felt. And as I got to know Sommer, he had this as a sort of fundamental tenet. We only can discover or find what we already know. But the two things don't resemble each other exactly. There's a dissimilarity. You can be influenced by something. You can be influenced by the snake goddess. But what happens in your life is not exactly a replica of that. And so to be influenced is how you gain a vocabulary of experience that you haven't had yet. You get a vicarious vocabulary from others. And when you're profoundly moved by works of art, you carry that the rest of your life. I certainly have carried it. And I had that feeling in working with the Morgan Library. The things we saw there, the things we put in the show, many of them I had never seen. But had I seen them, I would have been influenced by them. I would not have forgotten them. When we went, that first time we went into the vault of the Morgan, we found a beautiful drawing by Albert Dürer, which is part of the Adam and Eve, which is a much larger drawing. It was the head of Adam. I immediately recognized the head of Adam because it was in the Morgan that I had seen Albert Dürer's Adam and Eve, the ink version, the preparatory sketch for the wood block, which are the wood engraving, which became the famous version of the Adam and Eve. It's just the most natural thing in the world. I mean, if you don't have sources, you're not going to, it's like making a deposit in a bank. It's like gaining the vocabulary of great words. If you don't have great words deposited in your emotional vocabulary, there's nothing to withdraw. And images work the same
Wow.
way. You're making a withdrawal out of your past experience, but you're adapting past experience to what's in front of you. You're still at the mercy of what's in front of you. That you didn't invent, that you're not responsible for, but you carry a reservoir of feeling that comes out of all your experiences, and you apply that to what you find. That's, I mean, that moment, that Robert Frank moment was very difficult. It lasted a year.
Yeah.
But I knew I could do certain things, but I would sometimes do them, but I would reject them right at the moment I did it, I would reject it.
Yeah.
One of the things that Callahan was fantastic with, I mean, after the first year with Callahan, over that first summer between the two graduate years, I worked in the street photographing ladies walking in the street like he had done. I more worked with teenagers, but I was making portraits of people as they passed by. I mean, they were Callahan's pictures. He somehow had authorized me, without saying a word, to make those pictures. They were his pictures in his city of the people he knew. And at the end of that summer, I showed him several hundred of those pictures. And he looked at all of the several hundred, flipped through them pretty quick, but he seriously looked at them. And he closed the box and he said, I wish I had made them all myself.
Oh.
And then he finished the idea. He said, there was a time I could have done all of these, and now I can't. Right now, you are where you can do that. I'm not. And what a gift that is to say, instead of you're copying me, or I own this, or this belongs to me, you plagiarist, you. Yeah, he said, I wish I had made these. There was a time I could have made them all.
Yeah.
In a way, he had made them all. But he acknowledged that there's a difference between each person's experience. The way in which you make the same thing is not the same as what someone else experienced.
Right.
And it's in the margin of an uncertainty and unknown. That's where you're working. That's where your work comes to pass.
I'm gonna try to do justice to a handful of different questions that came in and merge them into one question, if I can try.
Okay.
And really, for me, it springs out of that very moment where you decided, I'm not going to try to replicate Frank. I'm going to find another voice, and you started to step back and up and in the air. And initially, they were just really interesting viewpoints and compositions, but then they became images with a mission and a story. They became nuclear test sites and Mount St. Helens and so on and so forth. And I can't help but sit here as an art lover and just look at them and go like, I don't freaking need to know what this is about. I can just look at this as a stunning image of shape and form and composition. Uh, you know, I don't need to know what this is about, but you are starting to make work that has a purpose. And how does that equate to you? Is it important that people understand the
Yeah,
story
no,
you're trying
I
to
get that. I
tell,
get the question.
underlying the beauty of even devastation?
Well,
How
you
do
know,
you
it's
how do you balance that?
Bryce, a really interesting thing in 86, 87, 88, as those first things from Hanford and other really challenging uh, environmental situations. So I began to show those. It was really interesting. The criticism from especially the postmodernists, but from just critics generally, is how dare you treat something that's so terrible in a beautiful way? How dare
Yeah.
you take a
Oh,
beautiful
oh my
photograph
God.
of something which is disastrous?
Yeah.
Well, I said, well, I'm not responsible for this disaster. I'm only responsible for the care with which I photographed this. And the light, this happened for me at Hanford. Flying over that, I'd gotten an aircraft almost spontaneously. Went into an airport, they called somebody, they came in, we got in the air. I thought, I'll never be allowed to see this. And then 30 minutes later, we were flying over the place where the first nuclear reactors were built.
Yeah.
And there's that ghost of a city. And I'm thinking, this is the most poisoned landscape on Earth. Probably. I didn't really know then. And about that moment, a beautiful light broke through the clouds. And
Only chance
just
is
this
fair.
transcendent, beautiful sunlight cast on the ground. And I thought, the light doesn't care. The light has no concern. So it's not up to us how the light looks. The light is transcendent. The light is eternal. And I felt, okay, I accept that the light is showing me its beauty. That's what I'll have. And I'll adhere, I quoted Brancusi earlier, simplicity is complexity resolved. I mean, that's in some ways, that's what a photograph is. That's a still photograph is very different from a film. And I love films. As a young person, I was really deeply drawn to the narrative of films. And my first still photographs, I think, have two things as their background: the narrative of film, Fellini, Bergman, you know, the early filmmakers, the silent filmmakers as well, where they had to tell much of the image through the construction of image and sequence. But that and Renaissance painting. And Renaissance painting was a kind of storytelling that I really identified with. And that's what those early family pictures are constructed in a way as tableau, living tableau. And I knew that was something that I felt, I knew that from painting, but I didn't know it from photography. And if you look at photography at that time, the tableau quality of images, it's very little that have that, where you cooperate and get a pose and a set and a background. And the best example I know of it would be Gene Meatyard. Meatyard was designing his images with backgrounds.
Yeah.
And of course, I knew Meatyard and was deeply connected to Meatyard. I mean, I felt like that, you know, I was in a kinship circle with Meatyard. This idea of the people you know as the subjects and the background as having the potential of transcendent symbolic quality.
Yeah. We are almost at the full 2 hour mark, and again, I've all kinds of notes I wrote down. But what I love, and what I would like, if you would confirm this for all those in our audience who are trying to make meaningful work in what they do. I love it when you can sum it up in 6 words. And I don't know if you meant to, but you did. And I wrote it down. And you said, I look up, I pay attention. And I think that's a pretty fine message for anyone out there in whatever their endeavors are as artists and photographers. That's a pretty, that's a, you fell short of a haiku, but you're pretty close. You had 6 words.
Well, I can give you a Sommer quote that I carry in my back pocket for just such an occasion.
Oh, wonderful.
An interviewer once asked him, he said, you put your pictures together. I've heard you save things for a long time and assemble them, and it takes a lot to please you. He says, it's none of that. The important thing is quality of attention span, and to use it for acceptance rather than for negation.
Oh my
Quality of attention span, and use it for acceptance rather than negation. When you were saying, I did talk a lot. I laid a lot of language on top of the images, because I think that the pictures of the world we live in the way it's come into my experience, is if it would be like me showing you a picture of a virus and not telling you what it really was, what that picture represented.
Oh my gosh.
Revealed to you that our lives, our living situation is impacted by this thing, that this is a nice picture of this virus. But if I only show you the virus picture and you don't understand what it is, it's not the deeply meaningful experience that it could have been. And you only get to do it in this way, or books do it in their own way. And books have a muteness about them. They're in some ways quite silent.
Yeah.
But I feel a great at rest, at peace with the idea of stillness, and that the image is not that easy to figure out. It's all right if it's hard to understand. The image only can be verified by fitting back into your life. In other words, how you understand the image after the fact, after it's a few years old. Does it still fit into your understanding of your values in the midst of your own life? Can you still verify this from your own experience? Is the felt concept of what you understand to be here, does it still work for you?
Yeah.
And the picture, though, is a silent thing. That's the vehicle. Let it always be silent.
Well, Emmett, I think I can speak for our entire audience, and thank you so much for sharing this. This has been amazing. So glad to have been a part of this. For all those folks, we are going to make this available on YouTube so you can share with all your friends and make them jealous that I was here live when this happened. But thanks for you guys being here as the audience. Emmett, what a treasure. Thank you guys so much. And I appreciate everyone being here. Everyone have a wonderful night and a great weekend.
Thank you, Bryce.
Thank you, Emmett.
Goodbye now.
We'll see you guys.